We all know the financial health of our church has a big impact on the overall health of our church. And so the question is, how can we get people to give in a sustainable and healthy way? And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 ways of creating a culture of generosity at your church.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. We're going to be giving you 7 ways to build a culture of generosity.
I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yes.
But before we get into that, I'm also really excited to share one important announcement. If you're listening to this in real time, that tomorrow, if you're listening to this the day it comes out, or if you listen to the next day, today, January 28th, is the last day to pre-enroll for our Growing Your Launch Team course. You can go to practicalplanting.com/launch to sign up for $49. All the information is there about what you can expect and what to look like. If you're 2 years or less from launching your church, this is for you.
Yeah.
And like we said in last week's episode, if you find this podcast helpful, it's going to be more in depth and even, I think, more helpful. If this podcast is like you only listen to it when there's nothing else to listen to, then don't buy it.
Yep.
That's the test.
Yep.
But we were really excited about it. And I know that this is, maybe I'm supposed to say this, but the final price for this course will be $149 when it's released. So you can get $100 off if you do it early. It's 100% refundable if it's not helpful. I would tell you, like, with all integrity, I would have spent $149 for this 5 years ago.
Yeah,
if someone
sure.
could just like practically give me a plan of what to do, not just build a team and raise money, but how to go about doing it. So we really believe in the product, which I know you're supposed to say that, but I think it's true. So
Yeah, I mean, building a launch team is one of the big, challenges that everyone has to face. And we just found that a lot of the advice that's given is more theoretical in
it's
terms
like
of
not helpful.
build relationships and things that we know. And so we wanted to give a tool that'll help you actually have practical steps on how to accomplish this.
Yep.
And I think it's going to be helpful to pretty much anyone who's in that phase.
So practicalplanning.com/launch. There's a cost to it, but we have your back because today we are talking about how to build a culture of generosity at your church. So not only is building a launch team like the number one issue when launching a church, so are finances.
Yep, true.
And not just when you launch, but as you continue on as a church.
Yeah.
To preface this, our church is coming up on 4 years old, and we have always been above average when it comes to giving. So there's like stats you can run, like the average person, how much they give, whatever. We've always been above average. At the beginning, I thought it was just because we're a church plan and people are excited.
Yeah.
But it has stayed consistent. Even with the pandemic, we had a really good giving year in 2020, especially since we moved into a new building and all these sort of things. And so we want to talk about some of the things that we have done that I think have contributed to that. But I also want to give this preface that we are a middle-class church with even upper middle class people.
Yep.
We are predominantly white, and we're not downtown Raleigh. I mean, we're in Raleigh, but we're not downtown. We're not urban. We're not an ethnic majority church.
Yeah.
And so this is easier for us than it is for some of you. So I get that. This is not like you do these things and your financial situation will be good. But I do think if you do these things, they'll be better than what they would have been.
Yeah.
And so for some people, it's always just going to be hard. Money's always going to be tight. So it's not like do this and all these things will work out for you. But regardless of your situation, these tips are practical for any context.
Yeah, I think that's good. This isn't a checklist of how to go from where you are to having a culture of generosity, but it's things that will translate to pretty much any context, and it may get you exactly where you want to go, or it may just start leading down the right path. But either way, I think it'll be helpful.
Because at the end of the day, you have to have people that can give.
Yep.
Like, that's just a thing. But regardless of people's income levels or their ability to give, these things, I think, can help people do that.
Yep.
So here we go. Number 1, this might be the most obvious one, but always bears repeating, that you have to talk about giving, but you have to talk about giving often. So not just the once or twice a year when you have like a giving message or sermon like that, and then you kind of like apologize and you make this big ordeal. We actually talked about money yesterday, so inspiration, I guess, for this podcast.
Yeah.
But talk about it often and make it a normal thing, because if it's a abnormal thing, then when you talk about it, it's weird. People feel like it's taboo. They kind of feel guilty or weird to talk about it. But like, we talk about everything. Like, sex is for most of us not which is something we talk about. Pride. There's a lot of like sin issues or issues that really impact our hearts and our relationship with Jesus that are normal to talk about. And giving is normal. And so if you want people to give, you have to talk about it so that this stays in front of them, that it's a reminder and it's not some weird and taboo subject.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of talking about it often and not just when you I don't know, I guess need to. In other words, not just if you're trying to
Yep.
raise money for a mission trip or raise money for a specific thing or when you actually need the money, but it's just talking about it like it's a regular thing. And I think we can fall into this trap of like getting to the point where we need to talk about money. Like we've in the past handful of months have had some instances where we kind of needed to talk to the church about the financial state of the church and things like that. But if we had never really talked about money up until that point, then I think that would be a problem.
Yeah.
And so it's having that kind of built in where it's not like it's expected, but it's not abnormal to talk about. And then when you come to those times where maybe you need to talk about for a tough reason or even a good reason, it doesn't come across as you're talking to me about it just because you want money kind of thing. But this is just this is the culture of our church that we talk about generosity.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because there are seasons where you have to talk about it more. There's a project or you're moving or your church is in a difficult place financially, which 2020 has probably done that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But when it's a normal thing, it's not like they're only talking about giving when they want my money. It's just something that we talk about often. And so let me just encourage you. I think we have said this in previous episodes. We probably talk about money more than the average church. It's part of our partnership, which is our membership process. We send quarterly giving updates, not just at the end of the year, which is, we have various episodes on giving that you can go back and listen to. That's really helpful. So it's a normal thing and it's not weird. And I think if you talk about it, people will do it because people forget. It's not like they don't want to be generous, but they forget about it. They I'm going to go home and maybe set up online giving, and then they don't. Yeah. And so as you talk about it often, it reminds people that it's a thing that is good for them to do.
And I mean, we talk on this podcast in a practical sense and don't always talk in the most spiritual sense. But if we're being honest, if the only time we're talking about it is if there's a need, or if we're just not talking about it in general because it's kind of an awkward subject, then, I mean, you're not just doing like your church as a body a disservice, but you're doing the individuals a disservice too, because where where your money is or where your treasure is where your heart is going to be. And so if you're not talking about it just because it's an awkward thing, it's not just going to be a tough, it's not just going to be tough financially for your church as keeping the doors open and things like that, but it's really doing your people a disservice and not really pastoring them the way that they should be.
Yeah. So I think we know we're supposed to talk about it sometimes, but we would say talk about it often, and we're going to give another tip of how we do that in a few minutes.
Yes.
So talk about it often, or talk about giving. Don't make it weird. Number 2 is that you, as in pastor, church leader who's listening to this, you have to be generous. And it can't be something that you want everyone else to do to pay the bills for the church, but you have to live a life of generosity, and there's no way around it. I don't have any scientific data or whatever, but I just think, if you talk, for example, we talk about maybe events that you want to do for your church plan. If you're in the launch phase, and we say how you should do events that you're excited about, because people, if you're excited about it and you're passionate about it, that just kind of comes across. And not that you need to talk about your generosity, like your personal generosity, you shouldn't. But I don't know. I think that people can kind of tell, like, is this person genuine or are they not? And so you have to be generous to your church, to other people, to things in your community. It's tough because pretty much every pastor that I know and that I talk to is like top 10, sometimes top 5 giver at their church.
Yeah.
So let me specifically talk to like a lead pastor, right? And there's a discouragement there because you're definitely not one of the top income earners at your church. So I get that, but I also I would tell you you shouldn't be surprised because you should be more generous than the average person. If you're going to be leading, not that the pastor is like more spiritual than others, but if you're going to lead people in something, you have to do it yourself. And so you personally have to be a generous person. And I'm not saying because if you're generous, God will bless your church, but I don't know. I think if you're talking about generosity and you can do it with integrity, that there's a big difference, and it probably unconsciously comes out in how you communicate it than if you are kind of stingy, but you want everyone else to give.
Yeah, I think we all kind of know this, but for the majority, obviously there are outliers, but for the majority of our people, the amount that they give isn't always necessarily tied to their income.
Right.
Like obviously there are some of the more faithful givers and things like that. There are outliers there, but most people give an amount, and some people give more, even though they may earn less. So a lot of people's giving is mostly tied to how dedicated they are to the church, and so I think it shouldn't be a shock that the pastor should be in the top. And obviously, if you're income things do come into play. Obviously, you can't. I wouldn't say make sure you're the top 5 because that doesn't work in every context. Right. But make sure that you are giving sacrificially. And I think especially when it comes to preaching about these things, obviously you're never going to. How do I put this? You're never going to or you should preach on things even if they're a struggle for you.
Yeah.
It's not like you should have already mastered things before you preach on them. And so if it's a struggle for you, I think that's okay to still talk about it, but it needs to be something that you're at least working on. It doesn't mean you're necessarily at the place you want to be. And this is what we say to our people too, as we're preaching. Like, you don't have to tomorrow all of a sudden get to this super generous spot that you want to be, but if you're working towards it and maybe you have a plan to get there, then I think that you're in good shape. But I do think that people can not necessarily tell right off the bat, but that you do kind of talk about it with some hesitancy, or you do kind of have some reticence in your voice if you are speaking on this and not working towards it yourself.
And I think, and this is tough, but I'll say it.
Say it.
I think if you've been generous to people at your church, not to everybody, but if there's been people that have been tough and you have gone out of your way to help them, when you talk about generosity to those people, they're like, oh, this is like real to them.
Yeah.
And this is hard because it's like you can't help everybody at your church, and there's not always situations, and they might never be in a position where they can give to your church. So again, it's not like help them out so that next time you generosity, talk about they'll give you money. But it's just like people can kind of tell, and they know if you're real or not. And so again, there's not a scientific formula that if you give this amount, this will happen. But and this is probably the least helpful of all of these because it's like, tell me what I should do other than have to give my money. And I want to say be healthy. I think there's also a tendency, especially in the church plant phase, if the resources are too low, to give way too much to keep the church afloat and be unwise. And so you certainly don't want to do that. But you do want to be generous. And if you're not generous, you can't be too upset with your people.
Yeah, and I'll add a point 2B, or 2A, whatever, under this, is that you need to be generous, but that your church needs to be generous as well, as whether that means supporting a church, like sending out a church plan, or supporting something, or supporting the community. And I think that's really hard to do if you're not generous yourself. I think it's hard to try and lead the way in the sense of leading your church into being generous for another cause, not just for your own church, if you yourself are not living in a generous way. So I think it's helpful for the church to see that that the church itself is being generous, but it's gonna be real tough for you to make that happen if you're not doing it yourself.
Yep. So that's number 2, you have to be generous. Number 3 is that you should share quick stories of the impact your church has made on people. This is like the best thing you could do just in general. But I think we often forget to tie this to generosity. So when you're talking about generosity, and even when you're not. So yesterday we talked about money, and then we gave, at the end of the service, I kind of gave a financial update because we talked about how in December, we're doing this new building. We're just doing everything we can. We need you to be generous. And people responded overwhelmingly in December really well. And so, of course, I updated them at where we were, but I also shared a story of somebody who emailed me and how our church has like radically changed their perspective on faith. And stuff like that is helpful because it reminds people this is why you give. It's not like in our case, for example, so that we can keep this building because COVID hit and we moved in. That's not the point. Is to make it possible for us to further our mission, but you give towards the mission. And so whenever you talk about money, it's always helpful to tie stories to it so that people remember why they give. Or the week before, we shared an update from the church plant that we sent out, and they're launching in March. And so Adam, who's the lead pastor, sent us a video so we could share with our church. And it was another opportunity to say, your giving is what makes this happen. Like, it's really hard to watch stuff like that or to hear how God has changed people's hearts and not be encouraged and reminded of like, this is why we do it. And so just share stories. And every time you share stories, it doesn't have to be a giving ask. It's always good to remind people that when you give, this is what happens. And this is why we give, not for our church, not for our building, not for the church's staff to get paid. We give for the mission. And so sharing stories is really helpful, and always including the quick reminder that your generosity is what makes this happen is really helpful.
Yeah, I think sharing stories is something that we always want to do. Like, I think that's pretty well known, and we do it around like things like baptism and like other things where we're comfortable sharing people's stories, but I think that oftentimes we don't tie it to giving as much as we should. And the average person that's coming in who's maybe not involved in every aspect of the church, they may not tie that their giving is really tied to this person's faith, that is tied to this person maybe making a next step with Jesus. And so making that connection for them, I think maybe the first time some people have actually heard that connection, that I'm not just giving to keep the lights on. That helps, but my giving has a lot more of an impact than I really see. And so really making that connection for people, I think, really helps.
Yeah, I mean, even that's a great point. Whenever you do baptisms, just reminder, like, people's, how they've impacted this person has mattered, but also their generosity to make this church possible is making this baptism helpful
Yeah.
or making this baptism possible. And so share quick stories of your impact. And it doesn't have to be big. I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but part of the email I shared on Sunday, he just said something about how he used to live, he was part of our church and then moved away last year. And so he really misses the community and how this church has really just radically changed his view about faith in the church, something like that. And it's like, it was like a couple of sentences. It wasn't some like, I was a super big drug addict and now I am.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
that wasn't a thing. But even small things, people would love to hear how their generosity makes an impact. I mean, even if you were to give to a nonprofit or charity, sometimes, at least for me, I kind of think, well, what impact is this going to make?
Yeah.
Like, how do I know? But when you share stories like that, it reminds people, even if they're small ones, that God is doing something cool. And so share stories and always tie it in to just say, your generosity makes it possible. That encourages people to continue to give.
Yeah, and I think we can assume people know this sometimes. Like you mentioned
Right.
a couple weeks ago, we shared a video from Adam, who's the church planner we sent out. And one thing he said in the video, which I was glad he said, is he made it very clear. He said, if it wasn't for your generosity, talking about to the people at New City who helped support him when he left, he's like, this wouldn't have happened. And I think that we know that as leaders and stuff, and we know how big of an impact it made, but we may forget that the average person who maybe wrote him a quick check on his last Sunday here, wrote him $50 or whatever, and gave, that they might not put that together. And so making that overly clear that if it wasn't for you, this thing, I mean, obviously God can, work however, but if it wasn't for this thing, it wasn't for you, this thing may literally not have happened. And so I think just making that overly clear and remembering that not everyone really connects those dots.
Yep. So that's number 3, share quick stories of the impact your church has made on people, tie it to generosity. That'll help create a culture of continued giving. Number 4 is that you should mention giving every week.
Every week.
Now, this is probably more so for people that don't like pass a plate.
Yeah.
So we've never passed
true.
a plate, and there's pros and cons to all of it. So I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do something. So if you do pass a plate every week, well, then obviously you talk about it.
You're mentioning it.
We don't. Now, research shows if you do pass some sort of plate, then your giving is actually higher than those that don't.
Yeah.
But I think part of that is because those that don't talk about it every week because it's a thing. So for us, we have our next steps, or what you can call announcements. We don't talk about giving there, but at the end of our service, it's always super brief because we don't like to do announcements at the end because it takes away from everything that happened. But we always end our service the same way unless there's something unique. But typically, the person, whoever hosts or whoever did the next steps will come up and say, again, if you're new with us, fill out that Connect card. I'll meet you at the teal wall, which is our Connect area. Super short. And then if you'd like to give, and we've got a giving slide, you can give one of 2 ways, the URL link and then the giving boxes in the back of our auditorium or in the lobby as you leave. And then we say our bottom line, you are sent, that sort of thing.
Yep.
But we say it every week, and so that people know. And this is important because, again, we can forget that people don't know everything is. People have asked us, before we started doing this every week, people asked us how they could give. Like even new people. And it's like, well, it's kind of obvious. Like we have giving boxes and they're kind of obvious that they say give above them.
Yep.
But people they're not looking around. They're not sure. They don't know, especially if they're new. And so saying how you can give every week reminds people to do it, reminds people how to do it, and it makes it easy for them to do it. And so we would just say it doesn't need to be this long, drawn-out thing, but make sure you're mentioning giving every single week.
Yeah, and I would say that there is no exception to this. Like, I especially in the space we're in now and before we moved to our old space, it was, in my mind, because I'm here all the time, painfully obvious where to give. Like, you have to walk past at least 2 giving boxes on your way out in both spaces, but we've had multiple people. And I remember someone who had been coming for, like, a pretty, maybe a couple months, something like that, like an extended period of time, ask, where do I give or how do I give? And it's like, well, I figured everyone knew. It's just like you walk past it everywhere you go. Or it's on our website pretty clear. And so it's just a reminder that we know because we set it up and we see it all the time, but the average person isn't looking for it. And the average person necessarily doesn't show up to church planning to give that morning. They don't have it set out and say, I got to find the giving box or whatever, or I got to give online. And so talking about it all the time, I think makes a big difference. And it doesn't need to be, like Dylan said, doesn't need to be a big thing or take up a huge part of the service or be a huge, plea to give every week. But it's just a reminder of this is how you do it. This is, we're not afraid to talk about it. We believe we should be generous, and this is how you can give if you want to give.
And the good thing is, people then starts to see like your giving boxes.
Yeah,
it's like,
true.
oh, now I know where they are, so
Yep.
they'll see them. And my guess is that if you do talk about it every week, the people that are going to give, like let's say they're new and they're going to connect, they'll probably start giving sooner rather than later, just because it's a reminder and it's like, oh yeah, we do need your financial support to continue what we're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, we assume every dedicated churchgoer knows how much every church needs financial support, but it's just something that gets forgotten.
Yep.
And so if you don't remind them all the time, it's just something they're not going to remember.
Yeah, so that was number 4, mention giving every week. Number 5, and this kind of, number 4 helps us,
Yes.
is to make it easy for people to give. Make it easy and obvious
Yep.
for people to give. So again, we kind of know what you're supposed to do, but people don't think about it all the time and they don't know. So for us, for example, here's how we do it. We have a giving slide that is very obvious. Every time we say, how to give, it shows up on our screen, so they also can see the URL, which is newcityrdu.com/give. They hear it every week. And we have our giving boxes, which have our little logo, and then above them, there's like this piece of paper. I don't know how to describe it. I'm looking at one of them right now.
Yeah.
If you're watching this on YouTube,
Like
you
a
can't see it.
insert,
Like a paper
a
insert.
sign above.
Yeah,
it. Yeah, that
it's
says
just
give.
8.5 by 11. It says give with our logo on it. It's very obvious. And when you make it easy and obvious, people are more likely to do it. Now, we only give one of two ways: online or our giving boxes.
In person. Yep.
We don't do text. We don't have an app, and I don't remember if we've looked at research about this or not. But it just, the more options you have, I think we think more is better because there's more possible ways for them to do it. People they can't remember all those things.
Yeah.
And so we don't do text to give. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm just saying, like, be intentional about whatever you choose. We don't have an app that you can give also. It's just, you got to go online or you got to go right there, but it's easy and it's obvious. We say it every week. Like, it's not going to be, if somebody came to our church, they were like, how do I give? Or if you were to wake up one of our people on a Wednesday morning and say, hey, how do you give to your church? I think they could tell you.
Yeah, I think so.
Which is what you want people to do. You want to make it easy and obvious. If you have too many options or there's too many things to jump through, people just won't remember that, and they're going to be less likely to give.
Yeah, I mean, I think that 2 is a good number of options to have. And obviously, everyone has to have an in-person way. And online, however you want it to be, I think that having it on the website makes a lot of sense because either way, someone's going to access it from their phone, whether it's on your website or texting a number. And either way, like we experimented with text to give, just setting it up, see how it worked. And it worked fine. And I know churches do it super successfully, so I'm not trying to put it down or anything like that. But in my setting it up, it took just as many steps to set up your text to give as it did to set up online giving, and it both happened through my phone. And so I figured we have to have one because people have to be able to give from a computer. And so I have both.
Yeah.
And this just makes it easier. It's just this website or in person, and that's it. It's super easy to remember. So figure out whichever, avenues work best for you, but the less, the better.
Yeah, and it's like, churches can have like a mission statement and a value in their vision statement and their values, and they have all these things, but people don't remember them. People remember one thing. And so we say our mission statement is what we talk about all the time because remember one thing. The same with giving. Like if you're new or you're interested in giving and somebody says, here's how you can give on a Sunday morning. You can give online. Here's the address. You can text this number. You can give in person, or you can download our app. It's just...
It's a lot to wrap your head around. Yeah.
Just tell me what to do.
Yeah.
So we would say make it easy and obvious for people to give. And so also the obvious part, if you're doing it, and if you have like a giving box or whatever, have a sign that says give or something. Like part of the reason why it was confusing, especially at our old space and especially before we started talking about it every week, is we have our giving boxes with our logo. And so again, if you're a churchgoer, you kind of assume and know that's what it's for, but you don't necessarily know.
Yeah.
Especially if you're newer to the church. And so the fact that it says give right above it, like, oh, I know what this is.
And this is not something we did forever.
We didn't.
Because you visited, I think it was you, visited a church and saw that they had and it was not a complicated graphic at all. It just said give above. And you're like,
they had giving boxes like us, and they had like a little paper holder on top of it, and it was just give. And I was like, why don't we do that?
We do have these boxes, but if you don't know it, if no one told you what they were, they're just boxes. And so what are they for? So.
Yeah, and if you're fortunate like us, we've got a graphic designer that does a bunch of our graphics now, and he has our box in the graphic, so it's like very obvious.
Yes.
But anyway, make it easy and make it obvious. That way people can give if there's not a bunch of steps.
Yep.
That was I don't know what number that was. I think that was
5.
number 5. There we go. Number 6, keep your church updated on big picture financials. Now, what we mean by this is the more that you can keep the financial updates in front of your church without them having to ask for it, it really boosts your credibility. Now, this doesn't mean people won't ask, or they might be confused about something you said, but the fact that you're constantly taking like the first step to remind people, it's just really helpful. Now, I know the vast majority of churches, like, they're not shady. They want to be in front of the people, and they're thinking that maybe people don't care. They want to know. But again, think about your own giving. You want to know if your giving is making a difference. And if you have a church that goes above and beyond to tell you, periodically, here's where we are, here's where our needs are, it just makes you feel a lot better that they're actually like taking this seriously, even though you are, but if you don't talk about it, You know, so for us, we do this a couple of ways. Once a quarter, we send a giving update with some wins and lets them know how much they've given so far. So that's helpful for us because people might be like, oh, I'm not giving as much as I thought.
Yeah.
And it reminds them to give, but it also says, we know what's happening.
Yeah.
Obviously it's a little bit easier for now, but in December we shared where we were as a church. Last week we shared where we were as a church. Like, we do this occasionally just to remind people. Sometimes we'll do like little quick, like 5-minute or less videos, just to talk about where your church is, kind of the big picture stuff. And if they have questions, they can ask. But if you're the one that's going out of your way and not waiting for someone to ask, it just gives the impression, which you hope you have anyway, that you really care about their generosity and you're doing everything you can to steward it well.
Yeah, we pretty much just give quarterly updates of what we've taken in, what we spent, and versus our budget. And we just want people, and we know most people aren't going to read them. Like we know we're not fooling ourselves and think like everyone's clamoring or waiting for these updates. But the ones that do, we want them to know that their money's being used well, and that we're not wasting. Like, for instance, if they see something done like different with the building or something, or like we bought an expensive camera or something like that. If they see these things and they never hear anything about the budget, they may not understand like this is the actual need that we budgeted for, and not just us being frivolous with our money.
Yep.
And so that's just the way that we always are keeping them updated, that your money's actually being used well, and not just that it's being used well, but that we actually care what your money is being used for, and we're not just writing checks.
Yeah, and this is helpful too, so that every time you're talking about money, it's not because you're asking for something. And especially in the early days, again, people want to help, they just don't know what the needs are. So we assume everyone knows we need money, but they don't know what the goal is, what the target is, and so they don't know how much to help. But like, we moved during our building fund, we would every month or two or whatever, we'd give an update about where things are. Not asking people to give more, but just so that they would know. For example, here's where the money is going. And so having from time to time, whether through email or from stage, not doing a giving ask, but just saying, here's where things are, it's helpful. And I think it's also helpful to keep people in the mindset that this is their church. Just in our individualistic culture today, this is like the pastor's church or the staff's church or whatever, and I just go, but it's not my church. It lets them know, like, this is your church. And so, especially in the early days, we might think it's weird. I might even encourage once a month, take 2 or 3 minutes once a month, like the first year of your launch, just to let people know where you are, because it makes them feel like this is my church. We know what's happening together. We're smaller anyway, so let's not pretend we've got 1,000 people, and most people here are disinterested or whatever. If you've got like 50 people or less, they're there because they want to be there. So just keep your church updated. Don't always wait for them to ask for stuff. Let them know what's happening, and it reminds them to be generous.
And I think this is really helpful if you're a younger church planner, if you're in your mid-20s, whatever. If you're kind of on the younger end of things, and especially if you have younger staff, I think it helps bring a little bit of legitimacy for your older, more established, so to speak, churchgoers. Like, I think especially in the early days, like, I think we're at the point, even though we're all young, but we've been around for a few years now, I think most people are kind of just, unless they've been here from the beginning, they just kind of see us as a church now, not a church plant. But if you're newer, especially if you're newer and you're younger, I think there can be some hesitancy of, are you going to be able to handle things well? Maybe you've never managed something large in the past, or at least people don't know if you have. And so there's always a little bit of hesitancy, I think, in the very beginning, but especially if you're younger, that you'll manage things right. And not saying that that's going to necessarily push all these givers over the edge. If you do this, then they're going to all of a sudden trust you with all their money. But like, I think it does bring a little bit of legitimacy that we care what we're doing, or we care about your money, we care what we're doing, and we're paying attention to what's being spent. And even if me as church planner may not have the most experience in this area, I'm doing my best to be responsible with what I'm being entrusted with. Yeah.
So whatever that looks like for you, just find a rhythm of periodically letting people know what's up with the finances, the big picture stuff, so that they can trust you, it lends credibility, and it encourages them to keep giving.
Yeah.
And then last, but certainly not least, this isn't necessarily about getting people to give more money, but if you do this, people will be more generous.
Yes, true.
And that is to emphasize that this is their church. So we briefly mentioned this, but if people take ownership, then they're more likely to be committed and do what it takes to make sure the church is healthy. So even saying things occasionally, like, this is not my church or the staff's church, like, this is your church. Yeah. In our partnership process, which we call membership, like, we tell people, this is your church. And reminding people, I think, about like financial giving, for example, lets them know that because this is your church, I'm going to tell you this without you having to ask me all the time. And so, I think saying that and also meaning that, and even
Yeah.
things about what you say, like how you talk about the church. I don't know, around people, just small conversations, things like our and we, when you talk about your church in front of other people, it makes them, reminds them that they take ownership. Not that everyone has the same level of commitment. Obviously, for example, if you're church staff, you have more responsibility than a church member, but it's still as much theirs because we all have different contributions to make to God's kingdom. So emphasizing that this is their church will help them want to give, because we want to support things that are ours. We don't want to support things that are someone else's.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Not just saying that it's their church, but actually meaning it, like you're saying. Because I think it's really easy to say it. I mean, anyone can just say this.
Yep.
But meaning it in terms of how you're actually acting. Like if you never ask for, especially in the early stages, if you never ask for, say, feedback on anything, or trying to get other people involved, or if people try and give you suggestions and things like that and you blow them off. I mean, it's obviously this is a leadership thing, but if you're just saying this kind of these kind of empty words of just, this is everyone's church, this is your church, but no one feels like they can really get involved or feel like you're kind of steamrolling them, then this kind of falls on deaf ears.
Yeah. So yeah, this is their church. I think this also goes with, you have to be generous. It just kind of seeps out. If you truly believe that this is their church, and you might believe that, but I think sometimes of our language brings the other way. So you'll hear, at conferences or whatever, people will say to pastors, tell me about your church, or your church did this, your church did that. And it's like, I mean, sure, I get it, but it's like they didn't just do that.
Yeah.
Like they had people that gave and that served and that gave input, and it's not just one person. And so you truly have to believe and then communicate that this is not just your church. I know the vast majority of church planners would say, this is not my church. But if we don't say it, if we just assume people know it, then we won't say it and they won't think that. So communicating to people, letting them know and reminding them this is their church, they're more likely to support it. Because again, it's not, you could say it's unspiritual, but we like to support things that are ours, and not as much things that are somebody else's. So if this is my church, I'm going to do what I can to, keep it going.
And people like to feel like they make a difference. And if they are doing something where they're, whether it's giving or serving or whatever, they, much people say they don't want to be, people want to be acknowledged. And so just that simple acknowledgement of, this is not something that I did as pastor or that the staff did, but this is something that we're all doing together, I think just helps bring that little bit of acknowledgement that whatever you're doing, even if it's something small, we see it and we recognize it, and it's because of that this church is here, not just because of what we're doing.
Yep. So emphasize that this is their church, that your church is also their church. And those are 7 ways to build a culture of generosity. Again, we've always had above average generosity. Some of that stuff is completely outside of our control.
Yes.
God's just been kind to us, and people have had the means to give. But I also think that there are things that you can do to help create a culture of generosity. And we do these things and it's helped. And so I think regardless of your context, doing stuff like this will only benefit you.
Yes, I agree.
So thanks again for listening. Remember, practicalplanting.com/launch. Get onto the early enrollment if you're listening to this episode sometime in the future. And early enrollment might be done, but the course is out.
Live, yep.
And so you can also go to practicalplanting.com/launch and enroll in the course. And we even talk about money in the course as well. So all that good stuff, enrolled in. And thanks for listening. We'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.